Awesome. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to our pre-Christmas Relatorium talk. We are very happy to have Karen Little with us today. Karen is the proud owner of this YouTube channel, Awesome Reversible Knitting. So I met Karen at a math workshop in Calgary, and I was like very impressed with her talk. Like it showed me like how math is intuited from first principles, from something that we can see and touch, and how the intuited math feeds back into that thing which it is modeling. So I felt like this is a cool talk to have in Relatorium, and we were all excited. And Karen has kindly agreed to give a talk. And I think this is her first online talk with knitting. Like the in-person talk is much different, right? And Karen has put in like, she was so enthusiastic and she brought in so much work. So I'm very excited to hear her talk. And so before I pass the stage to her, Karen, would you like to tell us like what compassionate math means to you?
So hello, everybody. Nice to see everybody. Nice to meet everybody. So compassionate math for me. So she prepped me with this question, so I have a prepared answer. Thank you for that. And the way that I think is, I really like math. I'll tell you about my background in a second, but I really like math. However, sometimes it can be a little bit flat and black and white. And compassionate math, and I'm hoping that this talk will show that compassionate math adds the color and the texture to the math. That's what I Yes.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. Uh, And I think your talk is going to be that because Karen, we have like your family here. Like we have Karen's mom, Oma. Okay, Oma, can you please wave attending the talk? And we have Edmund's family attending the talk. I think this is the first time this is happening in a math talk. So this is awesome. On awesome reversible knitting.
Hey, there's my sister Nora.
Hi, Nora. All right. Karen, like,
Hello.
would you like to present? Like, would you like to start your talk? You could
Sure.
share your slides. Yeah.
Yep. Sounds good.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. Does that work?
Thanks.
Okay. Is that good?
Yep.
Okay. Well, look, see, there's more people in the thesis room. They're so wonderful over there. Okay. Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to Awesome Reversible Knitting. Like Priya said, my name is Karen, and in today's talk, we'll explore the math of reversible knitting. So a little bit about my background. I have a degree in math in operations research from Waterloo, and I'm not going to tell you how many years ago. That was quite a few years ago. And then I was in supply chain, which absolutely takes operations research and applies it to, in my case, a business environment. So it was a really great way to have math really being applied to business. And after I retired, my children actually encouraged me to start a YouTube channel about knitting and specifically reversible knitting. And so in this YouTube channel, I share reversible stitch patterns and projects hopefully in a creative and an educational way. And this year, I started to give a series of talks relating math and reversible knitting. And so this is the third talk, but it's the first in the series. And as Priya mentioned, she attended the second talk, the one that I gave in the summer. And then we thought that it would, and then she invited me to the Relatorium seminar. And I think it's a great fit. I think um, so, um, so my question is, who's familiar with knitting? So there will be a little bit of audience participation. I'll try to give a little bit of I'll try to give warning, but it might not work. Who's a little bit familiar with knitting? You can wave or you can say something in the chat. Yep, agreed. Fantastic. You can say something
Or you could even
in the
put it
chat
on.
if you like, just so that I have a bit of a sense. I saw was knitting, so I think that's fantastic. Yep, fantastic. We have another yes. That's great. Beginner, fantastic. You've seen people knit. This is good. This is important. Yep. as a student, fantastic. A beginner, fantastic. So that's great. So in my mind, the relatorium is meant to have people from lots of different backgrounds still able to relate to the subject matter, and I think that will happen today. And so, from an outline perspective, I will start a little bit with knitting, some basic knitting. You will not know how to knit by the time this is done, but just to understand a little bit the typology, the notation, and the dual nature, the duality of knitting, which is where the reversibleness comes from. And we'll talk about several different definitions and also some axioms. These are for flat knitting, so flat back and forth knitting. And at the end, we will end with the reversiblest stitch pattern that I know of, anyways, that I have seen. And throughout, I have lots of examples of reversible knitting that helps to explain and describe the mathematical elements of the knitting. So welcome to the Knitting Relatorium. I'm so excited. Okay, so in terms of knitting, knitting generally creates a surface of interlocking loops, and you can see here, you can see my point here, right? Yes, on the screen. Okay, you can see here these are interlocking loops. And at the end of the day, in the mathematical terms, I think anyways, it is isomorphic to the original yarn, which means that if you pull on the yarn, and I'm not sure if you've had a sweater or socks or so, when you pull on the yarn, it goes blip, blip, and then it goes back to yarn. Yes. And so from a knotting perspective, like a sailor's knot kind of thing, the loops are true bites. They are true loops that are coming out through another loop. And my topological joke for the day is it should not deform into a knot. If you end up with a knot, you're doing something wrong. So generally speaking, a flat knitting is worked from right to left when you're a right-handed knitter. So you start here at the start here, and you go in this direction, and then you go on row 2, and then you go in the back. So you've turned your knitting around, and then you go along the back, and you continue to go back and forth, and your fabric grows in this direction. And most stitch patterns have a stitch repeat, a grouping of stitches that you repeat over and over again, and a row repeat where that pattern of stitches, you might do, let's say, 2 rows or 3 rows or 5 rows, and you do those rows over and over again so that you have obviously a pattern. So there are two basic knit stitches. One is the knit stitch, and the other is the purl stitch. And the knit and the purl stitch are defined by how they're connected to the stitch below. So in this case, this orange knit stitch is coming over this blue stitch from below, and it's coming out forward. And the purl stitch is exactly well, in this case, the reverse, and it goes out behind or out under the knit stitch. And you can see this little blue bit here. Knitters refer to this as the purl bump. You can see here in the picture this red purl bump over top of this yellow loop. And in the case of the knit stitch, it's coming over top of that red stitch from below. And in this case, it's going behind, and you get this. And so this purl bump is actually part of the stitch below your knit stitch or your purl stitch. And we'll see this purl bump show up. And so, as I mentioned, knits and purls are the reverse.
No. Is it too loud? I don't know if it's bothering him.
Knits and purls are the reverse stitch of each other. So if you make a knit stitch on one side of the fabric, it looks like a purl stitch on the other side of the fabric because the two have an opposite orientation. One comes to the front and one comes to the back. So if you turn your knitting around, then that's exactly the opposite. And so we will be talking about knits and purls almost exclusively in this talk, but certainly there are lots and lots of other stitches, and there are other reverse pairs that stitches that are reverse of each other, and even quartets where there's 4 stitches that, depending on how you make it, they look the reverse or slightly the reverse of each other. And I've even found some self-reversible stitches, which of course is super awesome from a mathematics. And from a knitting perspective, you can't really tell whether, based on the structure alone, whether it was made as a knit stitch or made as a purl stitch, because you turn it over and it looks the same again. So I have a little movie here. This is the first little movie that I have, and you can see the knit stitch here that I'm pointing at, this yellow one, and now the yellow one is a purl stitch. You can see that purl bump in front, and then there's another knit stitch on that side. And when I flip the fabric over, you can see now that the knit stitches have turned into purl stitches with that red purl bump, and the purl stitch in the middle is actually now a knit stitch. So you can see the reversibleness of the stitches in the little movie. And in fact, when you look at, so this is definitely not reversible, and but you can see the reversible nature of the stitches. We'll get into the reversible patterns in just a second. And you can see this purl bump here. You would think, looking on this side of the fabric, that I made this using a knit and a purl and a knit. And in fact, I know, because I knit the little swatch, I know that that this row, when I changed colors, I was actually on the other side. So I made it as a purl, and then I made this as a knit stitch, and I made it as a purl. So you can see that they are from a mathematical perspective the same, except for on each side of the fabric. Oh, there was one thing that I forgot to mention before, and I apologize. If you have any questions in terms of clarifying questions, please ask. Make sure you can put that in the chat, or you can unmute if it's a clarifying question. The only request that I have is, if you have any open-ended question, like, have you ever thought of this, or what happens when you do this, you could leave those to the end, because I'll get distracted and we won't make it to the reversible stitch pattern. Okay, so oh, sorry, I'm going in the opposite direction. Okay, and so sorry, if you have any questions, please ask them if they're clarifying questions. Otherwise, so in terms of notation, there are two different notations. Math is full of different notations meaning the same thing, and the same notation meaning the same thing. And in knitting, it's very much the same. So there's two basic types. The one are instructions, where it's easy to follow. You say in row 1, knit 2 stitches and purl 1, and the stitches between the asterisks are repeated. So you do knit 2, purl 1, knit 2, purl 1, knit 2, purl 1. And when you get to the end of the row, you turn around and then you do knit 2, purl 1 along the back. And we'll talk about this stitch a little bit more in a few slides. And then the other possibility is in charts. You can see a more standard chart down here, where the dots on this side of the fabric look like purls, and unfortunately, the empty spaces are knitting. And because reversible knitting is very, very visual, I don't find that particularly helpful. And so I use different notation, and some knitters are a little bit upset with me that I do that. But I find it very, very difficult to see this. And in fact, when you look at this, you may not even see that it's actually the same as this. And so what I tend to use is a V to symbolize the knit stitch and the dash. And in fact, the V is what it looks like on this side, and the dash is what it looks like on this side, as opposed to perhaps the way that I actually knit it. Okay, and so this is a chart, and here are written instructions, and I will go back and forth between the two of them, just because, just the same as in calculus, sometimes it makes more sense to do it in one type of notation than in the other. Okay, and in this case, this is a 6-stitch 12-row repeat. So you do this little square thing over and over this way, and over this way, to get this. Okay, now this pattern looks reversible, but it is in fact not reversible. So we will get to some examples of that. And so then the kind of obvious question is how is reversible knitting different? And Yap says it's awesome, and I agree with Yap. It is in fact awesome, but really mechanically it's exactly the same thing. We're still making knits, we're still making purls, yarn over, knit to the other. Like, all of those knitting stitches are exactly the same, except it's about the design of the stitch fabric itself. And you're considering both sides to see what both sides look like. Often one-sided designs, it's very much a painting, where you're painting and you don't really care about what the other side looks like. Whereas in this case, it's a union. And so what happens then is that it looks good on both sides, and there's no wrong side. These are bad words for me in knitting, the wrong side of the fabric. There is no wrong side, and it's because we're making use of the duality of the stitches. The other advantages of reversible knitting is, most of the time, the physics are balanced between the knits and the purls, and I've got a whole bunch of slides on that in the appendix, if you like. But knitted fabric that's one-sided often tends to purl, and reversible fabric doesn't, because there's a physics balance in it. You're using the nature of the stitches as opposed to fighting against them. And so, anyways, for me, that makes a big difference. And then lastly, you have one wonderful texture of the knitted fabric. You can often get very simple repeats, simple row repeats. but it ends up to be this lovely complex structure, and you have wonderful wonderful fabric at the end. And so for me, it's technically intriguing because you need to make sure that it looks the same on both sides, creatively satisfying because you get all these beautiful things that you can make, and flexible because you can make a scarf as long as you want. You can just keep knitting until your ball of yarn is gone, and then that's how long your scarf is. Okay. Okay. So here I have a little movie of some
Karen,
reversible.
may I interrupt, please?
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Krill. So
Okay.
Krill asks, is it the case that all of knitting is just those two stitches in various patterns?
So the short answer is no. The long answer is, except for some of the movies that I'll show you, like what I'm showing on screen right now, what I'm talking about today is only knits and purls so that we can mathematically describe what reversible means I'm going to say in the most simple and the most basic way. So all of the stitch patterns that I'll show from a reversibility perspective today will, for sure, you can have knitting, you can have tables in your knitting. So for example, just happens that this is where I stopped the video. This has a cable. It's a reversible cable, which doesn't usually happen. But no, for sure, there's lots and lots of patterns that are not just knits and purls, some of which have reverses and some of which are self-reversible, and there's lots of variation. Okay, so the answer is no. For the most part today, I will be talking about just knits and purls because otherwise it gets a little bit too
Thank you,
complicated.
Karen.
So you can see here, this is a reversible pattern. Here's a lace pattern that's made with 4 stitches. This is a 7-row repeat that has a gradual change. And this is St. John's wort, which is not usually reversible, but I found a reversible version of it. And this one as well. This one doesn't look reversible. There's lots of knit stitches on this side, and it is in fact reversible. Okay, is that okay? Does anybody want to see the movie again?
I would love to see it again, just once.
Okay, this is one of my favorite movies.
Yeah.
It's so lovely. You see, it's the same. And this is the bark stitch. I have a video about this one as well. I haven't done a video about that one yet. Sometime I will. This is the mesh rib, one of my favorite videos, one of my favorite stitches. This is the rainbow scarf. It's very, very long. And St. John's wort, that's for a future video as well. Yes? Okay? Right. Mother says, okay, good. Okay, so here's some reversible knitting examples. Like I said, I won't be talking about these ones specifically. I'll be talking about more, I'm going to be more simple ones so that we can create definitions, create mathematical definitions. So the first definition, okay, that's very funny, thank you. So the first definition is, I'm going to call it a practical definition. What is reversible knitting? Something that looks good on both sides, right? That there's no obvious ugly side, that there's no obvious wrong side, which is not something that I like at all. And so here's an example of a stitch pattern. This is the movie as well. I'll start it in just a second. Here's an example of looking good on both sides. Okay, and so you can see the knit stitches here and the purl stitches here. And if you were to turn this over, if you were to look at it from the other side, all of these knit stitches turn into purl stitches, and the purl stitches turn into knit stitches. So in this case, I would argue that this stitch pattern looks good on both sides. There's no one side that's obviously uglier than the other, except that it isn't identical, right? It's not the same. And so there's lots of people that do reversible knitting, and their whole goal is to make it not look the same, but still look good on both sides because they want a scarf that looks different on both sides. And I think that's fantastic. But that's just not mathematically satisfying for me. So that's not the thing that I do. So this is a really good start in terms of looking good on both sides, but I think we can do better. And so the one, I'm going to say obvious, not problem exactly, for me it's a problem, but one obvious difference between this side and this side is the number of knit and purl stitches that you see on any given side. And so the next definition that we can talk about is what I call a balanced definition, where we have the same number of knit stitches and purl looking stitches on any given side. And so from a mathematical perspective, this is what I've done. I've defined this grid here, and each square then does pattern 1 curl up? No, it doesn't. It's just balanced enough that it doesn't really curl. But often when you don't have a balance of knits and purls, you for sure get curling. You have curling stitches because it's a balance, which is the balance of the knit of the knits of the purl. So from a balance perspective, we're defining a grid, and so each of these little squares then. This is an informal definition. I'll get to formal definitions in a second. But from an informal perspective, each one of these squares is a stitch. Okay, and I've defined this. I'll call it a function for lack of a better word. And each one of these boxes is +1 if it contains a knit-looking stitch like a V, and it's -1 and if it contains a purl-looking stitch. Okay, which is the dash. Does that make sense? Okay, so for each one of these boxes, you can imagine a +1 or a -1 sitting in there, depending on if there's a knit-looking stitch that you're looking at or a purl. So if you add up all of the knit-looking stitches and all of the purl-looking stitches, and you get to 0, then it means that the pluses and the minus balance each other out then, and you can say that your pattern is balanced. Okay. So for example, here's a 2x2 check, and this is a movie as well. You can see there's 4 knit-looking stitches and 4 purl-looking stitches, and if you add 4 to 4 and -4 and -4, you get to 0. So then this is a balanced thing. And you can see here this check. You can see these 4 purl-looking stitches here and 4 knit-looking stitches here. Okay, and you can imagine that this is then balanced fabric, which tends then not to curl up. And this is one of the great things about reversible knitting. Okay, so you can see the knit stitches and the purl stitches. Yes, this movie goes on too long. Okay, so there it is. Yes. Okay, so okay, so here are some examples also of balanced stitches, and here is a diagonal stitch pattern. You can see the diagonal.
Wait, I have a question. So my question is like, what if you have like an odd number of, like your stitch has like an odd number of rows and odd number of columns?
Yeah.
And then
Then
is the sum going to be is it possible that your sum is 0 then? I don't.
So I'm going to say if you have an odd number, you can never get to 0 because there's no stitches, right? So that's an excellent question. That's a really good question. You're exactly right. If you have an odd number, an odd stitch count in your repeat, I would say that it is not balanced. And I have got some examples of that in a few slides. It's an excellent question. I completely agree. If you have an odd number, it is not ever going to be balanced because you can never balance the minuses and the pluses. Not necessarily going to curl because one stitch here and there is not really going to make that much difference. But I'm going to say that it's not. So here is what I call a balanced counterexample. Here's a diagonal stitch, and you can see the diagonal of the knit stitches and the diagonal of the purl stitches. And if you were to take this box and tile it away, you can see how you would get diagonal lines through the fabric. And if I play the movie, right, you can see the difference, right? In one case, the diagonals go in one direction, and in the other case, the diagonals go in the other direction. You can see the difference. And here's another example. Here's L tile. For sure, there are 6 knit-looking stitches and 6 purl-looking stitches here. I knit a little swatch and took pictures of them. So here's the one side, and here's what the other side looks like. It doesn't look the same. It is balanced, for sure. And it lies flat for the most part, for sure. But it's not the same, right? It's not identical. So can we do better than that? Yes, but of course we can do better. So let's think about what reversible means. We can look at a piece of fabric and turn it over. And if it looks the same once we've turned it over, then we can say it's reversible, right? It looks identical on both sides because when you turn it over like this, you don't see it. And this is what the third definition is. I'm going to call it a strict definition on Y. And you can see our little grid here. If I take this and rotate it, like physically rotate it around the Y axis, I've got our little function, +1 for knits and -1 for purls. And so if you take your function and you reflect it in the y-axis, and you make everything negative, because as soon as you flip it, all the knit-looking stitches turn into purl-looking stitches, and all the purl-looking stitches turn into knit-looking stitches. So if you reflect it in the y-axis and you make all the minuses pluses, pluses, minuses, and you get back to where you were before, then I would consider this meeting the strict definition of Y. And so a stitch pattern is strictly reversible on Y if, when you do this, I'll call it transformation by reflecting it in the Y-axis and making everything negative, you get back to where you were before. You haven't really changed what it looks like for all of the X's and Y's, for all of the stitches in the piece that you're looking for. And we'll go back to our friend, the 2x2 checks, and you can see, here's the little movie, it's a little bit smaller, that if you turn it around, it still looks like checks, right? Because if you take all the pluses and all the minuses and you change them and you flip them and you make this one end up over here and this one end up over here by rotating it this way and making everything negative, you get back to where you were before. So you can imagine this little stitch here, this knit stitch here, where does he end up? He ends up over here and turns then into a negative stitch. And where does this negative stitch end up? Well, it ends up over here and turns into a positive stitch. So if you take your fabric and you make them, so here's another example, this knit stitch over here, where is he going to end up? When we rotate him, he's going to end up way over here, and then we make it negative, and then we can say that this also is strictly reversible on Y. Yes? Does that make sense? Okay? Okay, fantastic. Yes, and so here is an example of 2x2 rib, and I will play the movie. So here's 2x2 rib, right? And when you flip it over, it looks like 2x2 rib, because all the knit stitches turned into purl stitches and all the purl stitches turned into knit stitches. And in fact, if you look very, very carefully, I'll wait for the thing to finish. If you look very carefully, right here, you can see two knit stitches here, and they turn into 2 purl stitches over here. And the next 2 turn into knit stitches over here. So in the process of turning it around, you're looking at the other side. So if you watch these ones over here very carefully, right there, all of a sudden, when you turn it over, what is it going to turn into? They're turning into purl stitches here. Yes? Does that make sense? So all the positives turn into negatives and all the negatives turn into positives. Okay, so that's fantastic. But we still have a counterexample. Because of course we have a counterexample, because this is math. And here we have a different piece of fabric. And if I flip it, it still looks the same, right? Except if you think about this purl stitch over here is meant to turn into a knit stitch over here, which it hasn't. So it is not strictly reversible on Y, because if you flip it in around the Y axis this way, it isn't reversible based on the definition, right? But if you look carefully, what have I done? With my swatch, I flipped it in the other direction, right? And all of these purl-looking stitches up here are knit-looking stitches. Well, they're supposed to be knit-looking stitches up here, right? And perhaps there's another definition, which there for sure is, and that's a strict definition on X. So we have our same grid, and we have same knit stitches, and in this case, now we're flipping it over the X-axis instead of over the Y-axis. But again, all of the knit stitches turn into purl stitches, so we're making the negative of everything. But in this case, we're reflecting in the X-axis instead of in the Y-axis. And who are we going to use as our example? Our friend, the 2x2 check. So you can see, okay, you can see here, if you flip it this way, you still get the knit-looking stitches up here, and they have turned into purl-looking stitches up here. Yeah. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so we've got this idea of strict definition on Y flipping this way and a strict definition on X flipping this way. And you can see some kind of horizontal ribs use that. Oh, I turned to the left. Okay. Okay, so we've got 4 definitions so far. The practical and the balanced and the strict on Y and the strict on X. So, like, is that it? Right? Is that it? Well, no, of course that's not it. So we have strict on Y and strict on X. So here is an example of a vertical rib. So this pink side over here, and I'll show the moving in just a second. You can see the pink side definitely are vertical ribs, and this beehive stitch over here are actually horizontal ribs. I made this with a 3-row repeat over and over again this way. You can have both, like the checks that we've been talking about. You can have strictly reversible on Y and strictly reversible on X, or the check. The most basic of those stitches is the moss stitch, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next few. This is a 1-by-1 check, basically, and I'll talk about that. But first, we want to see the movie of these to show that they are, in fact, reversible. So you can see here that this pink runner is in fact reversible, and the beehive stitch also is reversible. It doesn't look reversible, but it is. It doesn't from one side. When you look at it from one side, it's always hard for me to imagine that it is reversible, but it is. It's just so good. Okay? Yes? Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the moss stitch and see if we can't glean some more reversible ideas from a knitting. We talked about knitting, then we talked about math with the X and the Y, but now let's go back a little bit into the knitting side of the Relatorium to see if there's something else that knitting can tell us about reversibility. Okay, so I call it creative reversibility because it's, so far anyway, it's not completely mathematical. So here's a picture of moss stitch. Moss stitch, technically speaking, is a 2-stitch, 2-row repeat. So this little yellow patch right here, it's a 2-stitch, 2-row repeat. And usually it's written as in row 1, you do a knit, and then you do a purl, and then you turn it over, and then you do a purl, and then you do a knit. Because of course, as soon as you turn it over, a knit turns into a purl, and a purl turns into a knit. So as soon as you're going along row 2 going in this direction, this actually, if you want it to look like a knit stitch on this side, you need to work it as a purl stitch on the other side. So this is a 2-row repeat, knit 1, purl 1, purl 1, knit 1. Okay, and most obviously it's balanced, so that's good, because if it's not balanced, like the Caesar's room question, it's going to be a little bit tricky for it to be reversible if it's not balanced. So here I have a little movie about moss stitch. And you can see the purl bumps very clearly, these little dots, and in between there, you can see the knit stitches, which tend to hide a little bit behind purl stitches in certain circumstances. And of course, when you turn it around, the knits turn into purls and purls turn into knits. And you can see the purl bumps of the knit stitches that you can see. Okay, makes sense? Okay. And so one fantastic thing happens with moss stitch, and this is one of the first reversible things that somebody told me a long time ago, and I'm not sure if they're here. I did invite them, but I'm not sure if they're here. This is one of the wonderful things that somebody told me, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago. By the way, if you add a stitch to moss stitch, it turns into a 1-row repeat. You don't have to think about your knits and purls. You always start with a knit stitch. And let me just go back. So here you can see this is an even stitch repeat. And if I add this in here, okay, all of a sudden it turns into a 1-row repeat. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. Then when I go to the other side, if I want it to look like a purl on this side, I need to work it like a knit on the other side. So knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. And every single time you start with a knit and you knit, purl, knit with an extra knit at the end. It turns into a 1-row, which is fantastic from a knitting perspective because you don't have to think about what row you're on. You don't have to think about where you're supposed to start. There's no right side and wrong side. We don't talk about that here, but we don't, right? It's all the same because you're doing the same thing on both. Okay. That's it. Okay. So, oh, right. And of course, this is why I made this be animated because I was going to forget to say it. It's still balanced, right? So we're good because we've added we've added 2, or in this case 4. So it's still balanced. There's still the same number of knits and purls. So we haven't messed up. Okay. So here's another example. This is ferro rib, and I don't know if you recognize this from the notation slide. Knit 2, purl 1. Okay, we talked about that before. This is ferro rib. It's a little bit dark of a movie, but you can see how lovely this is. And you look at it and you think, oh, I don't know if it's going to be reversible, but it is. But it is because what happens with ferro rib, and I have a lovely, this is one of my first YouTube videos, was the ferro rib one because it's one of my absolute favorite stitches. If you turn it around, it looks the same. And the reason for that is because when you do knit 2, knit, knit, purl, knit, knit, purl, and then you turn it around and do knit, knit, purl, knit, knit, purl, you get this column of knit looking stitches and a column of purl looking stitches, and in between you get moss. And so this column of knit looking stitches, when you look at it from the other side, looks like this column of. The trouble is that it isn't really Y reversible because of this odd moss row in the middle. And if you turn it around, this moss, this knit-looking stitch turns into a purl-looking stitch, and then it's not a knit-looking stitch. So it doesn't look 100% identical. But from a creative reversibility perspective, absolutely it looks reversible. You tell me if you can see the difference between the one side and the other side. No, you cannot. But mathematically speaking, it is not, right? And that's what this talk is about, is the math of reversible knitting. So from a creative perspective, absolutely it's reversible. From a mathematical perspective, it's not. Now, if you take this piece here and you flip them over instead of having a knit, okay, then it does turn into Y reversible if you change your stitch pattern. But now it's a 6-stitch 2-row repeat instead of a 3-stitch 1-row repeat. So you make you make it way more complicated for some mathematical reason, which I'm not going to discuss. Okay, here I have one more example of creative reversibility, which is the basket weave. Okay, so here we have the basket weave stitch. It's a combination of the 2x2 check and a garter stitch, which is alternating rows of knit looking and purl looking. Okay, and so knit, knit, purl, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl, and then you do a row of knit, and then you do purl, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl, knit, knit, and you do a row of knit. So it's a wonderful 3-row, it looks like a stitch, a 4-row repeat, a 4-stitch, 6-row repeat. Okay, and here's picture of it. Okay, and again, it looks exactly the same on both sides. Yes, you can see the purl bumps. You can see the 2x2 check, and in between there's this garter row of knits and purls. Yes, and it looks wonderfully interesting. And the reason it's a bit complicated to turn around is because I made this into a Mobius, so that's why it's a bit fun. Okay, and so here's the thing. You can see though the wonderful texture of it. It has this lovely, I'm going to call it basket weave type texture. And so one of the fantastic things about basket weave is if you add a half of a stitch repeat, if you add a half a stitch repeat, all of a sudden it's a 3-row repeat. Okay, it's a 4-stitch 3-row repeat because at the end you end up doing the exact same thing for each one of these rows. And so by adding half a stitch repeat, it turns into a 3-row repeat as opposed to a 6-row, right? And that's much easier to work. Okay, and as Yap says, it also becomes Mobiusable, which is always fun. Okay, so right, so this is the part of the talk where I'm hoping to get some audience participation, and Yap is going to help us as well. And so the question is just anything creatively satisfying? It's just anything, as long as there's a balance, does it really matter? You know, if it's Y, it's just anything reversible? Or can we, if we look at the knitting side of it, can we think, can we find new mathematical, I'll call them axioms because they'll turn into axioms, but are there new mathematical ways of thinking about things if we look at it from a knitting perspective as opposed to just the X and the Y reversible? So this is a time for a game. So get your keyboards ready or unmute your thing because I'm hoping for some audience participation. And Priya, if I miss something in the chat, then please. Okay. So the first one that I have is this. So the question is this satisfying? Is this reversibly satisfying? Is it first of all reversible? Is it satisfying? Is it creative? Do you like it? So you can do thumbs up or thumbs down if you like. Yes or no. Oh, Jen says no. I agree, no. Okay. And so the reason is because it doesn't have a balance of knits and purls. You can see these 2 knit-looking columns and only 1 purl-looking column. So it is not reversible, but there's several different ways to change it. You can make it into a ferrule rib, like what we talked about, and make this a moss-type column, or you can add a column and make it into a 2x2 vertical rib like this, and all of a sudden, then it is reversible. Okay, so that was a good one. A little bit easy. What about this one? Okay, Steve says, people, I expect you to pay attention. What about this? Is this satisfying? Is this reversible? Is this creatively, reversibly satisfying?
Karen, you have a question regarding the first example, like would the first one be reversible on X?
Okay, so that's a good question, and I'm going to throw it back. What do you think? Krill is asking, what do you think, Krill? Would it be reversible on X? If I took that and turned it, would all the knits turn into pearls, and would all the pearls turn into knits so that it looks the same? I'm going to go with no, right? Because all of these knit-looking stitches, as soon as you flip them, they turn into pearls, but they're meant to stay knits, but that doesn't make any sense. So if anything, it is a vertical rib type pattern, but it is not reversible on Y, okay? Because this was actually that very initial yellow one, and odd can't be reversible because of the middle spot, right? Or at least odd can't be reversible on Y because of the middle spot. It can still be reversible on X, perhaps. Okay, so I think
That's it.
I've lost a little bit. It's going a little bit too fast now, but okay, okay, yeah. Excellent, fantastic. I'm really happy to hear that because that's the whole point, right? Is to think about it and flip it over in your head and think, oh, does it look the same or does it not look the same? And it takes some, I'll say, practice. I would like to say, even I sometimes look at a pattern and think, oh, yeah, that's reversible. We're good. And you do this hand wavy thing, and then okay. So this is not reversible, not on X, not on Y. It's not balanced. It's not anything. As soon as you do this, certainly it's reversible on Y. It's balanced, and I would consider it to be. So what about this one? What about this one? Is this satisfying? Is this reversible? If I flip this over, would it look the same? If I flipped it this way, if I flipped it that way, would it look the same? Aha, Priya says not. What about Thesis? Who asked the question in Thesis? What do you think, Thesis? Okay, I think I saw a thumbs down there. It's a little bit dark over there, but I'm going to go with thumbs down, right? Because it is 5 by 5 and 5 times 5 is 25, which is odd, which means it cannot be balanced, right? I'm going to say could not be reversible, okay? And so the way from a knitting perspective that I see this is that there's a whole row of knit-looking stitches and a whole column of knit-looking stitches, but there is no whole row or whole column of purl-looking stitches. So if you were to turn this and look at it from the other side, you would not then get back this whole row of knit-looking stitches on the other side because there's no whole row of purl stitches. Yes, does that make sense, Thesis? Okay, look. Oh, so glad. Okay, and so again, there's several different ways of changing this. This is, I'm going to say the way that I would do it is I would then add a whole row of purl-looking stitches, right, which cuts this column off, which is fine. But at the end of the day, at least there's a whole row here and a whole row there, and then all of a sudden there's okay. And we'll get back to this one in just a second once we've finished our yes, yeah, it's a game, not a test. Okay. Okay, so this one I would say. What about this one? Okay, so I would say no, because again, there are these two columns of knit-looking stitches, and there are not two columns of purl-looking stitches, right? And so if you were to move these to here, okay, then if you do a repeat, then all of a sudden these two are next to each other, and there would be two knit-looking columns, and then you would say this is a broken rib. Now we get a little bit tricky. What about on the first row? I knit across. And then on the second row, I do purl across. And then I go back and I do knit across. And then I do a purl. Is this reversible? Thumbs up or thumbs down? This one. Because there's two columns of knit-looking stitches, and if I were to repeat this again, then this column here would end up being right next to that column there, and I would end up with two columns of knit-looking stitches by the time I split it. So I'm going to say not necessarily strictly X or Y, but creatively. Creatively, you can't really see the difference between the one side and the other. Okay, and in fact, it isn't really X or Y, and that's what we'll get to next. So if I did all knits on one side and all purls on the other side, if I worked it as knits on one side and worked it as purls on the other side, would that be reversible? Oh, this is stockinette. This is the bane of reversible knitting. This is the most horrible thing ever. You don't ever want to do this because you would create knit-looking stitches, and when you do purl on the other side, they look like knit on this side. So you have a whole sheet of knit-looking stitches. Okay? Okay, so what happens if for the first 100 rows, I do knits and purls, and then I switch it around and I do purls and knits? I guess technically, yes, because you've got a piece of knit looking and then a piece of purl looking. So technically, if you did the whole, see, I'm even out of the frame, you did the whole thing of 200 rows, technically it could be reversible, but it still looks ugly. So in my mind, it's not that. What about this one? On row 1 and 2, you knit, and on row 3 and 4, you purl. So you do knit, and then you work it as a knit, which looks like a purl. Then you do purl, and you work it as a purl, which looks like a knit. And then you do knit. Yes. Okay. Because you are doing the same thing on both sides. I call these doubles, where you do 2 the same rows, and then 2 the same rows, and then 2 the same rows. As long as you're doing the same on each row, even if it's split, doing 2 knits and 2 purls and 2 knits and 2 purls, then you're still going to get something reversible. And the last example that I have is 3 rows, where you're knitting along, then you do knit and purl, and then you're knitting along. And if you stop, not reversible. But if you keep going, now you're going to knit on the other side and do the knits and purls and then knit on the other side. So as soon as you have an odd row repeat, you're doing the same thing on both sides, right? As soon as you have a 1 row or 3 row or 5 row or 7 row repeat, then you end up changing the side that your repeat pattern starts. Okay? Okay, I think everybody's been tested out. I feel like I'm losing a few people, but that's okay. So let's talk a little bit.
Yes. Question? Yeah, I see the question. Like Krill asks, why is the bottom middle reversible,
Yes.
which is the one?
So I think that was this one over here, right? Why is the bottom middle? Is that this one you mean, right?
That's right. That's right.
Bottom middle. Sorry, this one?
The one that has been circled.
The one that has been circled. So let's talk about this one, exactly what I want to talk about, because clearly it's not Y reversible and it's not X reversible, but somehow it still feels reversible. Like if you think about wallpaper groups or something, somehow it still feels reversible, right? And so let's talk about this one a little bit more. So this is the thing that I figured out in the last couple of months, is this concept of Z reversibility. I didn't have this idea before, but because of talks like this, all of a sudden the math comes back out, because in my head, first of all, and I sort of wave my hand, but then if you have to think about it mathematically, all of a sudden you have to think about why it is and outcomes. So we've got our same grid again, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to rotate it up. We're not going to turn it. We're not going to flip it. We're going to rotate it like it's like the hands of a clock. Yes? So this knit looking stitch is going to end up over here. And again, we're going to make it. So if we, and it feels really weird, right? And it took me a long time to figure this out. If you rotate this and you put this over here and you make everything negative, and you get back to where you were before, then I would say that it is strictly reversible. So here's an example. This is the hurdle stitch. So here is this purl looking stitch. And if we rotate this and make it negative, we're adding it. If we take this side here, we rotate it and put it here and make it negative, then it turns into. So if you take this whole square and you rotate it 180 degrees and you make everything negative and you get back to where you were before, then you are strictly reversible on Z. Yes? Okay, can I get some thumbs up as to whether you are understanding what I'm saying? Uh-oh. Okay, so I've got some more examples. So then, sorry, the question is, does it always work, right? So in this little piece here, in this little green piece here, yes, and in this little piece, perhaps not, but the question is, does it always work? So let's go back to the one that we were talking about. This one was not reversible, but as soon as I added this one, it feels reversible now, right? From a creative perspective, it feels more satisfying. And in fact, if you think of this spot right there, yes, it's a good question, Krill. I don't know the answer to that. Somebody that I'm working with, Jeff, he really likes the matrices, and we've been starting work on the matrices to see if that's the case, but I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I don't know, and apparently that's an okay thing to say. So if you think about this, if you think about this little dot, and you think about the whole thing rotating around that little dot, then this one over here turns into this one over here, and this one over here turns into this one over here. These two over here turn into those two purls over there. Yes? Okay, so you can think of this now, and now this is reversible on Z, right? So we had X, we had Y. Of course, it's very satisfying that we have Z as well. So let's look at the double mistake rib that we had before, and by switching them, we have here. Clearly, we can't just rotate in the middle of this because that's not going to work because everything needs to turn negative. But if you shift the whole thing and you move these two columns over to here, now all of a sudden you do have a center of rotation. And these two over here end up being rotated and turning into those two poles over here. Yes? Because you rotate it and make everything negative. If you get back to where you were before, then you are. Yes? Can everybody rotate that around in their head? I know, it's a reversible knitting. Like, you think knitting, why do I have to think so hard? I know, because it's math now. Okay, and the ferrule rib, which is one of my favorites, also has a point of rotation. If you take these two purl stitches and you rotate them 180 degrees and make them negative, you get two knit stitches. So the ferrule rib also is Z reversible. It's not technically X and not technically Y, but it's Z. I think that's fantastic. It's my favorite one, and I was so sad when it didn't meet X and Y. The same as the basket weave that I showed before. If you shift it, if you shift the pattern here, then all of a sudden you get a center of rotation as well. And so at the end of the day, the wonderful thing about the Z reversibility is that it conserves that stitch pattern structure. It conserves the full columns or the it conserves the structure of stitches. Okay. Mirrors. I'm going to fly through a couple of slides. Wallpaper groups love mirrors, the reflections and the glide reflections, all those lovely things. Unfortunately, mirrors do not work with reversibility because everything needs to turn negative and not just mirrored. So yeah, some of them are reversible, some of them not. So these are my creative axioms. When I try to create new reversible patterns or take a pattern that's not reversible and create a reversible version of it, this is what I do. If it's across an odd number of rows, 1, 3, or 5, I call them naturally reversible. So odd stitch moss, ferrule, a whole bunch of ones. If it's doubles, if you do the same thing back and forth, and then a new thing back and forth, and a new thing back and forth, the doubles, those tend to be reversible. Sometimes topographically, like exactly the bumps don't quite work out with hurdles, but you can make some adjustments and make it work. I like to induce reversibility by repeating things in a vertical way or repeating things in a horizontal way to create that vertical or horizontal ridge. You can adjust the edges so that it makes it a little easier and so that you can Mobius things. And you also have to think about the fact that the repeats can't be huge compared to the size of your project. If you're making something small, your repeat has to be very, very small. So from a mathematical perspective, we can also create axioms. It needs to be balanced. If it's not balanced, you're hooped. Mirrors, reflections don't tell you anything. Not necessary, not sufficient, doesn't help you in any way. You can talk about strictly reversible on Y or X, or hello, Alexandra. You can talk about strictly reversible on Y or X or Z, like we talked about. You need to have an even stitch repeat or an even row repeat, or otherwise it doesn't work. One thing that I find interesting is that if you have a small pattern like this, you cannot be all three of strictly reversible on Y, X, and Z. Because in this case, it has to be the purl has to be there. In this case, the purl has to be there. And in this case, the purl has to be there. And now is not balanced. And now but for sure, if you take something and you add, you could be X and Y reversible in this section and still have an axis of rotation in another area of the. So 2 out of 3 at most strictly, but if you're a little bit more creative or you're a little bit more relaxed, then that works. Okay, so here's some robust definitions. And again, I'm not going to go through all of this because poor Yap, his little eyeballs pop out already, and this is too much. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But basically, from an informal perspective, I made the grid. And from a formal perspective, what I've done is I've moved the stitches not from the boxes, but in the intersection of the odd integer lines, and then the axis of rotations, the Y and X, are on the even integer lines, and then the Z points of rotation are here. They can also be here or here, but not right on the stitch. Yes. So formally, I kind of wrote it up because I wanted to make sure mathematically that it works. But from a formal perspective, that's a little bit more robustly, I suppose, this is what it turns into, that the stitches end up on the intersection on the line. Okay, and if anybody wants to talk about this a little bit more after the talk, I'm more than. Okay, so ladder of reversible. At the beginning, if you have all knit looking stitches, you are not reversible. Practically looks good, but clearly not the same. Balanced, you have an equal number, so this is getting a little bit more reversible. Creative or lax, it looks identical, but maybe not completely mathematically. You start rotating on Z, you conserve the structure. It doesn't look exactly the same from an X and Y perspective, but you're conserving structure. And then we get to the reversiblest stitch pattern. Okay, so with the reversiblest stitch pattern, no, the issue is that you can't do it with just knits and purls. You do need to have a little bit more complexity. So I want to go back to the stitch structure for the big finale. And at the end of the day, what happens is if you're flipping it this way, you're taking your knit stitch and you're flipping it upside down, right? So this is going to create some issues. For some stitch patterns it works and some it doesn't. The same as if you rotate them on Z, this guy here goes upside down, right? And in this case, when you have all knit looking stitches, now you can recognize this as all knit looking stitches, it works. But usually for knit purl combos, it doesn't. As soon as you rotate it, you get this wonky thing going on. And for any knitters out there who've ever tried to undo their knitting from the bottom, from the cast on edge, and it doesn't work, and it gets caught, this is why. This is the reason why. So the answer, of course, of the reversible stitch pattern known was created by mathematicians and mathematical knitters at the University of Chicago, Isaacson and Petrosky. And they were trying to create Mobius, and they were trying to create helical Mobius, and they created this lovely stitch pattern. And this is how to make it for any of the knitters out there. You can make it if you like, and this is what it creates. They call it the Mobius stitch. It's reversible. It's seamless around Y, X, and Z. It is seamless at the cast on and at the join and the round. All together, it is the most lovely thing. And so if you think about this stitch here, and you can look here, this loop here, you can see that you're rotating it and turning it into a loop here. And this one here, if you flip it in a Y direction, it ends up over here. And what was the other one? Oh, yes. And if you flip this in an X direction, then you end up down here. So you can see that it is and Y and X and Z reversible. It is also seamless at the cast on and the join at the rest. Isn't that the most wonderful thing? And then you say, yes, but can we see a picture of it? Yes, you can. I made a little movie of the lovely Mobius stitch. So here's the Mobius stitch. I used yarn that's not fluffy so that you can see the stitch structure. I'm not 100% happy with it. I think that there's some improvements that I could make to the actual knitting of it to make it better. But you can see there's the loop in one direction. It's a two-faced stitch. You see, there's the loop going up over here and the loop going down over there. It's a two-faced stitch, and that's what makes it reversible this way and that way. And in a minute, I will flip it this way and that way. There's on the other side as well. There's the two-faced stitch, and now I think I'll rotate it. Oh, look, there it is, rotated. Now, in this case, it does look like this one shows up over here, but that's just because I was a bit uneven in the knitting. It does, these ladders here are kind of too big for what it should be. So there's the Mobius. Isn't that lovely? Yes? There. I rotated in all directions, and I can't remember which side I started with, honestly. I just kept turning it and rotating it. Why is it called that? It is called that because they developed it specifically for helical Mobius, which is a whole different talk altogether, so that it would be seamless and reversible in all of the directions. And they created it specifically to create Mobius. Helical Mobius, not Mobius strip. Transverse Mobius, helical Mobius. And so, as a summary, reversible math lies at the intersection of math and art. So awesome reversible knitting is right there in the middle between math, ecology, tiling, lots and lots and lots and lots of math that we haven't even talked about, and art. From I'll call it directions of research, there are for sure things that are unknown. There should be actions for other ones, Mobius knitting, for example. Christine, who's at the U of C, and Jeff They are, I'll be working with them in the next couple of months to think about 2D manifolds, the open and closed and orientable and non-orientable ones, to see if we can create some axioms and patterns and ways of thinking about that. Wallpaper groups, I have a feeling that I'm missing something about wallpaper groups. There must be something about, like with that Z rotation thing, that must be a wallpaper groupy type of thing. The other thing that I'm really, really hoping is that the undergraduate research, if you have an undergraduate research project that we're looking for students to help me build a reversible knitting design app. As you noticed in the talk, here's a pattern. Does it look reversible? Well, I don't know. This app will tell you that. Okay, and I have just one more slide, thank you slide, of all the people that helped and that are very, very, there's many, many more, but these are the ones that I wanted to make sure that. Okay, so I'm sorry I talked for too long. Yeah,
No, wow. Thank you so much, Karen. This is an awesome talk. Like, this is very inspiring. Actually, I'm inspired to take a knitting course from you when I come to Calgary. And like, I think like this is great to see math and art side by side playing with each other. This is very cool.
Playing with each other. I think that's a fantastic way to put it. Playing with each other. Exactly.
Yeah. That's super cool. Let's thank Karen, first of all, for her awesome talk, like this lovely ideas. Yeah.
Thanks very much. It was great.
Excellent. Thank you, Nora.
And Karen, we are right on time, like, which is great. Like, we didn't like you. Yeah, it's awesome. Like, we have time for questions. So we are opening the floor for questions. Maybe we would keep the live stream on for 5 more minutes, and then we would stop the live streaming and we would take the discussion on Zoom. But yeah, please, like, people who have questions, like, yeah, the floor is open to questions now. You could either raise your hand or put it in chat or just like ask Karen the question you want to ask.
Yep. Nora is
Do you use the straight needles?
So my preference is circular needles, whether I'm knitting straight or in a circular way. I find them much easier in my hands. The straight needles stick out, and by the time your project is very big, it gets very heavy on the end. And if you use a circular needle, even if you're knitting back and forth, you can still use circular needles, and it just feels a little bit more comfortable. It doesn't stick out quite so much. Yes, you should try the Mobius stitch. It takes a bit of fiddling. If anybody is interested in having a chat about that, I can tell you what I learned about it. It's a very, very interesting stitch to knit as well, because it works out differently than what you than how you think it's going to work out. It's very interesting. That said, if you are a knitter, it relies on twisted stitches, and if you create twisted stitches, they tend to tighten up and not loosen anymore. That's why I made it out of that weird polypropylene. Hi, Alexandra, I see you. It tightens up a little bit, and that's why it looks that swatch looks the way that it is. Absolutely, yep. So Mobius scarf. I love making Mobius scarves. Clearly, it didn't fit into this presentation, but yes, I've got some videos about how to knit Mobius in several.
Oh yeah, put a link to your YouTube channel in the chat so that like people can have a look.
Yep, it's called Awesome Reversible Knitting. Yep, so if you look it up on YouTube, Awesome Reversible Knitting, then you can find it there.
Hi, Karen. It's Andy here. I'm actually one of your subscribers to your YouTube channel, and I'm visiting Nora and her husband at the moment. It's been a really interesting talk. I'm not a mathematician particularly, but it really puts things into context that you explain on your YouTube channel. And if anyone is kind of got a buzz from this, the channel is really good. And now we all have the understanding of the mathematics behind it. I think it would be even better. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I've been thinking about making a little bit more mathematical content. I've hesitated a little bit because the videos are already too long, and if you start with the math, people will just tune out. I'm a little bit afraid, but maybe, yeah, I'm a little bit hesitant. Yeah.
Well, it makes it clear for me now. The math behind it.
Comments there.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And so to me, this is what the talk was about. If you think mathematically, and then you can understand reversible knitting. And if you think in a knitting way, then maybe it makes more sense from a mathematical perspective. That's what I was hoping, exactly that.
Yeah.
In this talk. Lots of knitters are really, really not mathematical, and I don't want to I want to say scare people. It's about compassion math, right? The last thing in the world I want is for people to say, no, knitting is too hard because I don't understand math. No. You can like music and not understand math. And yes, Alexandra has multiple Mobius scarves, and it's possible that there are you in the background.
I see that both math and knitting are very creative adventures, right? Like they both like feed into each other. It also, your talk is very related to Edmund's talk on like how abstract and physical spaces communicate with each other. So you took a physical space, made it abstract, and then like bring it back into the physical space. Like, yeah, that's lovely.
And in my mind, that's what operations research does from an optimization perspective. So this is a little bit what I've done from a reversible knitting perspective. Yes, exactly. I think that's a really good observation. Yeah.
And we had Irfan knitting throughout your talk. Like he's very inspired, I think.
I wonder if there are other symmetry patterns that you've explored beyond the X, Y, and Z rotations.
So the closest that I can come to with that, because I've thought about that a little bit as well. The closest that I've come to with that, and I'll kind of point to this, and it sounds a little bit silly, but through the fabric, because yeah, I don't know how to, let me go to the next one and then I will explain. But so right here, you can see these loops. These are pull-up loops, and then next to it is this round structure, and then another pull-up loop and a round structure. So on the other side of the fabric, this round structure is in fact this pull-up loop, right? So this pull-up loop on the other side looks like this structure on this side. So this here is the reverse of this here, but it doesn't look like it at all. Like it's not reversible from it looks identical, but it's the other side of it. It's the back side of it, I suppose, which, when you're doing painting or something or tiling a wall with, wallpaper patterns or something like that, you don't get that sense, right? You don't get that sense of if it's white on this side, it's black on that side or whatever. You don't really get that sense. So, and you can see here when I turn the bark stitch, called the bark stitch because I thought it looked like tree bark. And one of my children's subscribers, he thought that this looked like a little doggy. So then I thought, you know what? It's bark stitch. Anyway, so if I let it, oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's kind of what I had in mind as sort of an emergent pattern so it's not the same. It's not exactly reversible in the strict definition, but that there are related patterns on the one side to the other that emerge out of the combination of the detailed local structure.
Yeah. So I mean, I use this is not a knit and purl face, almost, just except for the pull-up loops. This is almost knits and purls. It's just those pull-up loops that you're dealing with, and it's exactly what you're saying, that they are the reverse of each other. I was looking into wallpaper groups because Christine and Jeff said, yeah, go look at wallpaper groups. I really had a lot of exposure to them. And there's, I don't know if you know what those are, but there's 17 different ways to tile a wall with stuff. And some of this came from that in terms of it's a diamond lattice, or it's a square lattice, or it's a long rectangular lattice that this reversible knitting is, I'm going to call it hanging off of, that it's built on. So this one, for example, is a square, what's it called, like a checkerboard type lattice. It doesn't really look like it, but it's a checkerboard lattice that this one comes from. And the other ones are more diamond shaped, that you have a diamond and a diamond and a diamond, and you're creating something then on the other side in a diamond. type shape. So that's the only one I can think of, is to say the structure or the texture of it as reversible properties. But yes, if you can think of other X, Y, and Z, I mean, we live in a three-dimensional world. I guess we can go to Mobius. I have a Klein bottle too. I made some Klein bottles to go into the fourth dimension, if you like. If you have an answer, I would love to know.
That's awesome.
I also had a altogether different question. I wonder if you are aware of any engineering applications of these questions in manufacturing or something like that.
For sure, there other people do that from a material science perspective. Certainly, other people do that in terms of thinking about like the stretch of knitted fabric stretches this way and this way, and certain patterns stretch this way or stretch this way. I don't know, I have a swatch somewhere that I can't remember where I put it. Anyway, in terms of different fabric will stretch in different ways depending on how it's created, and in fact, depending on the makeup of the knits and the pearls. Yeah, so I would imagine yes. That's not something that I'm looking into, but yes, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have it somewhere, but no.
Karen, I'm wondering what made you to get into the mathematics of reversible knitting? Like, how did it start and how was the journey?
Yeah, so my first knitting project was garter stitch, just all knits, and that was great. It didn't look very nice, but at least, you know, it made a nice scarf. And then the second one, I thought, oh, well, I'll add pearls into there. So I knit on one side and purled on the other side. And it curled and it looked like crap on there. I was so disappointed. So from the third project, I thought, never again am I going to make one-sided knitting projects. And it's very, very difficult for me to make one-sided fabric. I have an example, and it took me a long time to, and even here it's in Fibonacci and it looks reasonable, but already from the third project, I said, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm only going to knit reversible patterns. But there's only so many of them out there because not too many people are dedicated or focused on only reversible knitting. And lots of them, they like the aesthetics of having two sides different, nice, but different. And for me, I'm way too analytical to have the two sides be different. So then I started looking for reversible patterns, and then after a little while, I said, "Oh, I can see this, but if I change this and this and this, it will be reversible." So then I started doing that and creating reversible patterns. But it was knitting; it's creative, so I would just sort of wave my hand and say, "Yeah, it's reversible in some way." And then in the spring, my daughter Alexandra, is she still in the thesis room? I don't know if she is. Anyways, she up there. Yeah, there she is. There's my daughter. Everybody say hi to Alexandra. She said, "Thank you, Frank."
Thank you.
She said, "I have these colleagues in math, and would you like to talk about the math of reversible knitting?" And I said yes. And so then this year it's been very much more about making more robust definitions and more specific definitions, as opposed to the hand waving I was doing before.
Thank you, Karen. How was it, the process of coming up with the math behind reversible, or it's not the math, but like coming up?
Yeah, with math.
Yeah.
So you can see here reversible on Y and reversible on X. So I had been doing this for a long time, saying, okay, if I want to make it look like the other side, you either do a thing and next to it you do the opposite, the reverse, and then the next thing, and you do like this. So you could make a vertical ribs, or you do a thing and then you do the same thing, and then you do a thing and you do the same thing, and then you turn horizontal ribs. So that's what this slide is about, to say that there's these there's these two. But after that, it was, you can do odd row repeats, you can do doubles, which tend to be this way, but not necessarily. Checks and diamonds come into play. So I'm sorry, I forgot the question. Say the question again.
So I was like, what was this? How was this process of discovering math behind the reversible knitting? Like, yeah, you're answering.
Okay, so it started with these. It started with these. I'm going to call them creative axioms to say, how do I make reversible fabric? Well, this way. But then when you have to formalize it into math, then you need to think, okay, yep, there's a Y type of way and an X type of way. Then what about the other one? And then that's where Z came from. And so far, I haven't found any that they're not Z reversible. I mean, you can't say I haven't found any, therefore there aren't any. Obviously, you can't say that. But lots of ones that I've tried diagonal patterns even and chevrons and all sorts of things that you would think would be a little bit tricky to do rotating on. I can find an axis there to do rotating. So it started with creative axioms and then went, okay, if I'm giving a math talk, I better write it down somehow. Mathematically.
Nice. Thank you, Karen. I think at this point we will stop the live stream, and like if people want to leave, that's good. But like, yeah, Karen, like if you have time, we would like to have you around more, and like so that people can
I
ask.
can talk about knitting for hours. Just ask my family.
Thank you so much, Karen. So yeah, Niels, we could stop the live stream. Yeah, so more questions, please.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
So I don't have a question. I just have a comment that